Excellent. Let's start, since you're so disciplined that you silence yourselves. I think it's then time for me to welcome you in this panel today for Yaprak Gursoy's new book, for which we, in particular she, are very, very excited. And congratulations, Yaprak, for this. We still have advanced reading copies because the book is coming out
in July.
And it is about military rule and democracy, regime consolidation in Greece, Turkey, and beyond. There are some books here that we can circulate for you to live through. But it's a particular pleasure to have Yaprak present her book to us today. And that this also coincides with her being an academic visitor at CSOC's St. Antony's College here with us. And indeed, Yaprak has been one of our very beloved and active fellows, visiting academics that have been with us the past year. And Yaprak has, she's a political scientist, and we mean that with the full kind of sense of the term.
No one is perfect.
With a PhD from the University of Virginia, and this is her PhD basically that is being published now, but then with a career at, among others, at Bilgi University in Istanbul, where she is an associate professor. And she's been working on democratization, military rule. This year she's been doing comparative populism. So a lot of interesting stuff on Yaprak's plate. And discussants, we are also particularly pleased to have with us Stathis Kalyvas, who's a professor of political science at Yale University and director of the program on order, conflict, and violence, and he's a fellow at All Souls here. And Stathis is also a political scientist, so he's got a different, but also he's got a historical perspective in his work too, and very relevant to discuss Yaprak's book because of his work on conflict as well as on Greece. His books in Greece are bestsellers.
No one is perfect.
And Laurence Whitehead, who is a senior research fellow in politics at Nuffield College, and one of the fathers of transition to democracy and democratization and Latin American politics. Thank you very much for being here. Yaprak will present for half an hour, and then 10-15 minutes for the two discussants, and then we can open up for wider discussion. The floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you, Othon, for the introduction and for convening the seminar. This is obviously a momentous event for me, and this is a momentous event for my career, again, obviously. And I'm very happy that I'm celebrating, as Calypso always says, a book launch is actually a celebration. So I'm very happy that I'm celebrating with friends and family, and with two scholars, Stathis, Laurence, and Nancy in the audience as well, whose works have greatly influenced my understanding of regime change and Greek politics. Thank you for coming. Indeed, it is the most wonderful way to bring 15 years of research. Now I'm so emotional, I'm going to cry. Yeah, I am really overwhelmed.
You're being recorded, so don't do
it. No. We'll erase it, it's going to be fine. It's 15 years, actually. I started working on this 15 years ago when I was a PhD student, as Othon said, at the University of Virginia, and this was the year 2003. Then the dissertation covered Greece and Turkey from their independence until the 1980s. So it was mostly a historical analysis of two countries. And I finished the dissertation in the summer of 2007, and then I started teaching in Istanbul. If you're familiar with how academia works in Turkey, associate professorship is a title given by the Higher Education Council, meaning the Turkish state. And you cannot make anything that comes out of your dissertation count towards your associate professorship. It's a silly rule. They have now changed it, but that was the case in my time. So I put aside my dissertation because I had to, and I wrote on similar subjects, but different cases, different time periods. But the burden of the dissertation and converting it into a book had, so much weight on my shoulders, as my colleagues know very well. And I started going back to the dissertation only in 2013, after all that stress, basically. And it took me 2 more years to actually convert it into a book. Then, as you know, the review process with the press began, and I made the final finishing touches in April 2016. Now, I feel like I have to stress that date, April 2016, underline it, because that was, of course, before the coup attempt in Turkey. And my luck and, the unfortunate events occurred when, the book was out of my hands, and it's the book on military interventions, right? So I could not really incorporate the coup attempt into the book, but I could only add like an afterword, 2 weeks after the event, not knowing, where Turkey was heading actually after this incident. So the book has a long story, and this is why it is so momentous to be here today launching it. Now, in 15 minutes, I cannot possibly summarize 15 years of work, so I'm not going to be able to go into details with especially the cases. But I'm going to be what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be telling you what the question of the book is, and then its contribution to the literature and the theoretical framework of the book. Then we can have a discussion on the details people are most curious about. So let me begin with the research question, the main research question of the book, which is how do authoritarian and democratic regimes originate in countries where the military is a significant political actor. The stress here is, of course, on the role of the military, which I believe can behave in 3 different ways if it is a historically dominant actor in any given country. So first, it can intervene in politics via short-lived coups, or it can establish or support longer-term authoritarian regimes, or it can come under the control of civilians. So I'm asking, why do militaries in some countries or at some points in time choose or are forced to choose one of these behaviors over the others? So this is the sub-question of the book. And I believe that this question was never asked in this particular manner in the literature. There are, of course, many works that deal with military interventions, but to my knowledge, there was no real explanation in the literature of why sometimes militaries intervene for short periods of time and why they sometimes intervene for longer periods of time. My main cases to answer these questions are from Greece and Turkey, which together have experienced 4 authoritarian regimes, 6 periods of democracy, and 10 short-lived coups, including failed coups, fragile coups, and successful coups. In a moment, I will briefly explain what I mean by fragile coups. This is a term that I coined in this book, and it's a kind of a new concept. And I feel like I must stress the time period here. In the book, the theoretical framework covers cases where the military is a significant actor, and hence it deals with the period in Greece until the military was brought under civilian control, which is the 1980s, and Turkey until the early 2000s is the period where the framework of the book covers. I hold, and I still believe, despite the failed coup attempt, that the Turkish armed forces were brought under civilian control, perhaps not democratic control, but civilian control in the early 2000s. In 2 chapters, I also talk about recent developments in both countries, because clearly the stories of Greece and Turkey do not come to an end when the military was brought under control. In half a chapter, I talk about the Greek economic crisis and its consequences on attitudes. And in another half chapter, I talk about the shift towards authoritarianism in Turkey since 2013. But the theoretical framework that I will discuss in a moment cannot be used to explain these periods in the histories of these 2 countries, because these are periods where the military's possibility to successfully intervene don't exist anymore. That, however, does not mean that we are short of cases. You can see here the variety that can be covered by just looking at these two countries. And this is also one of the reasons why I chose Greece and Turkey to study. The two countries are like a natural laboratory of different cases of coups, authoritarianisms, democracies, and they allow for both within-case comparison and cross-case comparison. They also allow for holding some factors constant, such as international factors, because both countries were Western and NATO allies during the Cold War and had close relations with the EU, allowing the EU to exert influence at critical junctures permitted by domestic circumstances. So the scope condition of this book, to use the political science terminology, is being a Western, European, and perhaps more importantly, an American ally, receiving a lot of American military aid, which changes the balance of power in society. In fact, I also applied a theory derived from Greece and Turkey to Egypt and Thailand, two countries that fulfill that scope condition. In one chapter, by studying these two countries and their more recent military interventions, I show how the framework can be used to explain countries that seem to exist in completely different contexts. One advantage of studying a few countries from a comparative politics perspective is that you can go in depth in understanding the cases, and that's what I did. I spent years, as I already explained, conducting field research in Greece and Turkey, and aside from doing research in the National Archives or reading memoirs, I also did interviews with 150 people in both countries. Most of my interviews were with business people, 50 from each country. And these business people were in critical positions of various business associations during the last overt coups between the 1960s and 1980s. But I also spoke with leading politicians, coup plotters, successful and unsuccessful, military rulers, journalists, and others. So this in-depth research and the interviews gave me valuable insights about the political histories of these countries from the perspectives of the people who lived through them. Now, the main contribution of the book is the question that it asks, which I already mentioned, which then led me to to give or provide a bridge between the old and new literatures on civil-military relations. By the earlier literature, what I mean is the period between 1960 and 1980, especially the 1960s and 1970s, when a lot of Western scholars, American scholars especially, were interested in the question of military interventions. Because this was when, in Latin American countries, military interventions were occurring. Scholars dealing with this question, and also scholars who pioneered the field of civil-military relations, people like Samuel Huntington, Maurice Janowitz, Samuel Feiner, Henry Bienen, among others, were students of modernization theory, or they were at least influenced from modernization theory. So they had this specific understanding of military interventions as part of a country's process of development. So they were thinking that as Huntington even has articles saying that some coups can be beneficial for the modernization of a country. But then with the transition to democracy of many Latin American countries in the 1980s, scholars kind of lost interest in the question of why militaries intervene and directed their attention, understandably, to the question of how to control the military. Now, interestingly, the new literature, for the most part, failed to speak to the earlier literature, as if the question of how to control the military was not related to the question of why the militaries intervene in politics in the first place. So a gap kind of developed between these two literatures. But also, the civil-military relations literature in general treated military interventions or how to control the militaries as a sui generis topic, kind of existing outside of regime change and how authoritarian or democratic regimes are established. Yet the literature on regime change, which I'm going to be showing in a moment, is guilty of not studying the military and the behavior of the military in detail. So in the book, I kind of bring together this false separation between the earlier and the newer literatures on civil-military relations and provide a theoretical framework that explains both regime change and military interventions, which was a very, very difficult task to do. And you are going to see what I mean in a moment. In all specific fields of political science, the literature on democratization, like all specific fields, has various different approaches, and I believe that my work falls under the approach that Robert Dahl has established at the beginning of the 1970s. I consider him as the pioneer of this type of research in the 1970s with his book Polyarchy. Now, Robert Dahl is one of the most often cited authors in political science and in democratization, but his work is usually cited for coining the term polyarchy, the concept of polyarchy, which is argued was actually better than democracy, because democracies do not exist in the in the world; they're just like utopic. So we should be referring to polyarchies. Seldom Robert Dahl's framework, which exists as it is exactly like this in the book, is used, explicitly at least. Now, I'm going to bore you a little but with this technical language, so bear with me, please. I'm going to be very slow, and you will be able to, I think, follow me. In Polyarchy, Dahl argued that the chance for a democracy, or in his words, polyarchy, to arise depends on two costs: the cost of toleration and the cost of suppression. Okay, so these are the two dimensions that we should be looking at. The cost of toleration, which is this green line that you see here, means in simple language the level of threat that the government perceives. So if the costs of toleration are high, that means that the level of threat that the government perceives is high. If the costs of toleration are low, that means the threat levels are low. The cost of suppression, on the other hand, the red line, and remember this red line is suppression. It's like it goes better with the red color, right? The cost of suppression refers to the power of the government when it wants to repress the opposition. So if the government is stronger than the opposition, then the cost of suppression will be low. If the government is weaker than the opposition, then the cost of suppression will be high. So there's kind of an inverse relationship between the two. So given these two variables, Dahl's basic argument was that if the opposition is highly threatening to the government, and if for the government it is easy to repress the opposition, then the likelihood of an authoritarian regime increases. So this is depicted here. If the costs of toleration are higher than the costs of suppression, then we would probably observe an authoritarian regime. On the other side of the diagram here, if the opposition is not threatening, meaning that the costs of toleration are low, and if for the government it is difficult to repress the opposition, then we will probably observe a democratic regime. Now, Dahl's work has led many scholars, as I said, explicitly or implicitly, to refer to these costs. And 2 years later, Gianna ODonnell wrote his book on bureaucratic authoritarianism, and he explicitly referred to Dahl and used a similar diagram. In agreement with Dahl, O'Donnell argued that in Latin America, with time, the levels of costs of toleration and suppression varied. So whereas at one point in time, populist regimes of Perón and Vargas in Brazil were possible, as the country is industrialized, the urban workers became active, making them a threatening force. And this is why the curve of the cost of toleration basically suddenly increases because of industrialization and urban workers' mobilization. In response to this threat, the industrialists and the military established authoritarian regimes, also because they had the power to do so, because the costs of suppression were still relatively low for them. Okay, so this was O'Donnell's interpretation. I'm going to wait. Right. So here's another interpretation of Dahl. This is my diagram basically of and reading Meyer, Huber, and Stevens, a very influential book again in democratization studies. In their book Capitalist Development and Democracy, these authors argued that the costs of toleration, basically the green line, remained constant over the years. According to them, the lower classes and the masses were always a threat. What changed over the years were the costs of suppression, the chances of successfully and effortlessly repressing the lower classes, the workers and the peasants. With industrialization and capitalist development, workers became unionized and self-organized, therefore stronger and harder to repress. As a result, capitalist development increased the likelihood of democracy. So, Rush, Meyer, Huber, and Stevens' approach has been supported by many scholars. Like I said, they were very influential, but there were also opponents to this type of approach. And Gerald Alexander, one of my professors at the University of Virginia, wrote a book on the sources of democratic consolidation, looking at the period between the interwar period and the post-Second World War. And he argued that what changed over time was not the cost of suppression. If the rightists wanted to suppress the leftists, they would always manage to increase their resources, come together and use repressive strategies. But what changed over the years was the cost of toleration, meaning that the leftists moderated their stance, they became social democrats, and as a result they started to look benign to the rightists. And this is when democracy consolidated. Now, there have been other scholars more recently, but less explicitly referring to the cost of toleration and suppression. Charles Boyce, not that recent, I guess, this book, but Doran Ajamola and James Robinson can be cited as examples. But in all of the works that I just cited, including Robert Dawes, which he admits in the book, the military is not given any autonomous role. There are usually two groups of actors: the masses, the subordinate classes, the peasants, whatever you want to call them, the left, the non-elites, in other words, versus the elites, the rightists, the aristocracy, the economic interest groups, or whatever. But the military is treated as a secondary actor, usually following the orders of the rightists or economic interests. But then we know from the civil-military relations literature that the armed forces have their own corporate interests that cannot be subsumed under class and political interests. So the military must be analyzed as a separate elite group along with politicians and business people. So in the book, I propose a different framework, a kind of a new figure. So what I have done is, first of all, to assume that the costs of toleration do not have only two levels, the low and high, but there can also be moderate levels, like intermediate levels of threat perception. And then I assume that if the conflict is among elites, okay, and if these elites do not socially mobilize their constituencies against one another, then the cost of toleration, the threat level, is moderate. If the conflict is between the elites and non-elite groups, and if these non-elite groups, the lower classes, socially mobilize to change the status quo, then the costs of toleration are high. I essentially then argue, as I will show, that when the military intervenes against an elite group, its intention is to stay in power for a short period of time. So if the threat level is moderate, then the intervention would be for a short period of time, because the logic would be, I can round up the threatening political elites, imprison them, execute them, write a new constitution. The lower classes, the electorate, are not threatening. They can go back to, voting for mainstream parties. But if the military is trying to repress the lower classes, then they would have to establish an authoritarian regime. That would be their intention, to establish an authoritarian regime for a long period of time. Also, I have taken the cost of suppression and added the moderate level there as well. And I assumed that the balance of power among conflicting groups, whether they are the elites or the electorate, depends on three factors. So let's just look at here first, and then I'm going to show you these. First, historical circumstances, right, such as state building, political and socio-economic development will determine how much power the military or the pushes in the military will have vis-a-vis society. So it's mostly a contingent factor, basically. But the second factor would be coalitions that form among the elites, between the military, business people, and political elites. This would determine the power of the elites when trying to suppress the opposition. And finally, the unity of the military. All things being equal, if there's a coalition, if the military is unified, then the cost of suppression will be low, and it will be easier for the military to suppress the opposition. This is the lower portion of the diagram. But if there is no support and the military is disunited, okay, here, and the pushes do not have enough resources, for instance, because they haven't planned the coup properly, okay, the end result would be the total failure of the coup. Okay? So this would be the cost of suppression would be high and the coup would fail. Between these cases would be the moderate cost of suppression and the fragile coup outcome, which I'm going to be still talking about in a moment. So step by step. So here is how I combine the cost of toleration and suppression. Now that we have the independent variables, this is basically the independent variables, we can start placing the dependent variables, meaning the regimes and military interventions. So let's look at authoritarianism first. This area, the line and the area around this line would be the area where we will probably observe an authoritarian regime. This is because the cost of toleration would be high, and this would be the area of authoritarianism. If the threat levels are high, in other words, if the source of threat is perceived to be the majority of the electorate, then, as I said before, the outcome is an authoritarian regime. If there is a coalition among the elites on the establishment of such a regime, then the authoritarian regime is consolidated. This is why it's here, okay, because of low cost of suppression. I used a simple criterion to distinguish consolidation for the authoritarian regimes. If there are no contentious actions such as a protest, rally, insurgency against the regime, then the regime is considered consolidated. And examples of such regimes are Turkey between 1931 and 1946, Greece between 1936 and 1941, the Metaxas regime. If there is no coalition among the elites and the military is divided within itself, then suppression will be difficult, and hence we are likely to observe protests from the social groups that the regime is trying to repress. And examples of such regimes are Greece in 1967, Turkey between 1923 and 1931, Thailand and Egypt today. But we have to see how the regimes will progress, right? I mean, still, we don't know yet whether they are going to consolidate, will be able to consolidate or not. Now let's look at democracy. So the black line and around that line is the area of unconsolidated democracy. And let me remind you that this is a framework where the military is one of the dominant actors. So, I mean, think about it in those terms. If there is elite conflict and if the military is a dominant actor, the level of threat would be moderate. Okay, so this is why it would be an unconsolidated democracy. There would be frequent military interventions or threats of violence in society. And these are the examples of coups that I'm looking at. One by one, Turkey in 1997, a case where there was a coalition for the coup. The military was unified, and hence suppression was easy, meaning that the welfare party was and still is gone. So the radical version of political Islam. Turkey 1960, 1971, Greece 1922, 1925, Thailand in 2006 and Egypt 2011 are cases where the elite coalition and the military's unification were fragile, and hence suppression was more difficult. And the military was forced to make a transition to democracy before it could achieve its aims. So this is the critical point. The military intervenes with certain aims. I'm going to get rid of these elites for good, but then can't really get rid of them. Goes back to its barracks in precarious circumstances. And in the next elections, the group that the military tried to repress comes back to power through elections. That's the definition of a fragile coup, basically. And finally, we have cases of total failure of coup attempts, 1962, 63, Greece, 1933, 35. And the recent coup attempt in Turkey would also be here. Total failure because there is no support among the elites and in society for the coup, because the military is disunited, plus there's very poor planning for the coup. So the contingent factors do not allow the pushes to take over. Now, Turkey in 1980 was a hybrid case because of the perception of the source of threat. The military and its supporters at the time believed that lower class activism was due to elites' mismanagement of the situation. So the military saw lower class activism as a threat, but blamed it on the mainstream politicians. This is a really strange situation. But if you know the case, you know what I'm talking about. The outcome of this coup was also a hybrid. It lasted longer than any other coup that I'm dealing with in the book. It was much more repressive, again, than any of the coup periods that I'm analyzing in the book. And some even call this period an authoritarian regime. But for me, it wasn't an authoritarian regime because it did not try to institutionalize itself as an authoritarian regime. It tried to institutionalize the military, its own power, through a constitution that was democratic but very, very restrictive. So it deliberately made a transition to an unconsolidated democratic regime. So the final outcome is basically, I'm reiterating what Dahl says, if there is no perception of threat among the elites, and if the lower classes, the leftists, the electorate are perceived as benign, we observe a consolidated democracy depicted here. The costs of toleration are low, but at the same time, the cost of suppression will be high because attempted coups or violence in society will not have support from society, or because there would be a power balance among opposing groups. And Greece after 1974 and especially after 1981 would be an example. So let me end my presentation here and leave the floor to our discussants.
Thank you very much, Stathis. Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot for the opportunity to discuss this book. It was a great chance to read a very stimulating and very interesting book. And so let me start by saying that there were three reasons why I liked it. The first one is, as you pointed out, because I think it's an intervention in the way the literature has evolved that tries to combine the best of different types of approaches. So very simply, a simplified way of thinking about the evolution of the literature on regime change, which is one of the oldest and probably most persistent ones. It started by being extremely structural, very much emphasizing features that tend not to change slowly, that tend to be constant over time. And that was one of the factors that also influenced the famous series of studies of democratic breakdown by Linz and Stepan. And then in the 1990s, it changed. It moved very much on focusing on agency as opposed to structure, looking within a set of established structures, how do you get changes? And of course, the thing that's striking about this kind of contrast is that the first type of literature was looking at very slow changes over long periods of time, whereas the second one was looking at fast and rapid change in a period in which structures did not change as much. And of course, it's very easy to match those two different perspectives to very different political landscapes. A landscape in which things change very slowly, and then a landscape in things change very, very fast. And so you can see how, in a sense, methodological choices are very often responsive to the political situation that surrounds us. And then what happened in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years is the emergence of what we may describe as superstructural theories, Carles Bosch, Acemoglu, and Robinson, in which things are examined in the span of human history almost. And so the ambition is to explain both rapid and slow change using a very simple analytical framework. In the case of Acemoglu and Robinson, basically one variable, inequality, and how that. And the benefit of these kinds of approaches is their extreme parsimony, but then when you try to bring them down to explain specific changes, it's always very difficult to make them match. That is, it's one thing to see the connection at the aggregate level. It's another thing to actually see the match when you bring in the specific details. And so it's very interesting to see this book as an attempt to try to bring elements from both approaches and provide a sophisticated and eclectic mix. And so I think that's very nice. The second reason is because it's a comparison of Greece and Turkey. And I've always thought that those countries obviously come from the same matrix, the Ottoman matrix. Mm-hmm. They've interacted with each other. You can argue that for a very long time, their policies were reactive to each other, either implicitly or explicitly. And I was always surprised why we didn't have more comparative approaches trying to bring the two together. And the third point, which is related to the second one, is that the perspective is a sort of long perspective for standard political science approaches, not perhaps the scale of human life as in the most recent work, but certainly long enough to cover the 20th century, which has the advantage of providing more variation on the dependent variables, so more data points, and certainly bring to the fore the discussion of various very little known coups outside Greek history. And it's very interesting to see those put in comparison in a larger setting. Usually when there are comparative studies of Greece, they have tended to be very much in the context of the Balkans, but leaving Turkey outside.
Southern Europe also.
Yeah,
Southern Europe also.
Yes, or Southern Europe in the case of transitions to democracy, but the longer perspectives, the more structuralist ones have been primarily the Balkans. So I like that very much. And that brought me, and this is where I'm going to move in the issues for discussion and debate. So what are the questions that have been sparked by your analysis? So the first one that comes directly from that is a very interesting puzzle that comes from bringing in a post-colonial perspective. Mm-hmm. If you look at most colonial and non-colonial empires and their legacies, a thing that tends to be true across most instances is that the imperial core tends to modernize quicker than the imperial periphery, and that is not the case in the case of Greece and Turkey. Greece modernized politically and economically earlier than Turkey. So why is it? It's a very interesting question, and I think it's worth asking. The second set of broader issues that I want to bring to the fore is the broader implications of the theory. It's a theory about essentially transitions to democracy that are a function of the extent to which the civilian leadership of a country is able to control the military. Mm-hmm. Now, there are two sort of intuitions behind that. One intuition is the structural intuition. The military is seen in most structural approaches as the executive committee of the ruling classes. So the military obeys the ruling classes. The other perspective is the perspective of the civil-military relations literature, in which very often the military acts as a semi-autonomous or an autonomous actor. And I think you try to integrate both approaches, but certainly you're leaning towards the second one. But that brings a very interesting sort of question that is related to the evolution of politics, which is the recent decoupling of the military and the logic of military coups from civilian control. That is, even though it seems that there is a secular trend towards the establishment of civilian control over the military, that is not always meaning that that control is going to be democratic. Yeah. That is, we are in a situation in which, on the one hand, military coups have been declining very noticeably, but on the other hand, a set of new authoritarian regimes are emerging, which are not either military in origin and sometimes do not necessarily depend, in a narrow sense, on establishing, having the military behind them. In fact, establishing a civilian control over the military is consistent with authoritarian regimes. You can have a military that is fully civilianized and therefore a perfect tool for non-military authoritarians. So the military supports an authoritarian regime not because they like the class outcome of that regime, but because they have to obey the civilian authorities. So in a sense, the military-civilian literature has achieved its aim. The goal of subjugating the military to civilian authorities has been achieved, but that does not necessarily mean democracy. So where does that leave us is the question, since the big puzzle in political science has always been that idea that by establishing control over the military, you would usher democracy. And we're discovering that this is not the case. Given those trends, is there something that your theory or your intuition can tell us about how politics are going to evolve? Is the present trend of this decoupling just a glitch in a process of secular democratization, or is it signaling some change? So I would like to hear you on that. The third point that I would like to make is very, very briefly some points about methodology. One of the problems that I always had with Doll's approach was that I couldn't really figure out the difference between the two dimensions, the cost of toleration and the cost of suppression. Sometimes it felt like those things were a flip side of each other, and indeed some of the indicators appear on both sides. For example, whether elites are divided or whether lower classes are threatening appear on both sides, which means perhaps it's the same dimension. And if you look at their distribution, well, you have the two extremes in which they coincide, they're completely the opposite, and nothing much happens at the center. Now, what you're trying in your book is to specify the things at the moderate levels, which I think is a nice way to think about that, but still doesn't make me feel more comfortable about the distinction between the two dimensions. The second aspect of this problem, it may be that the two sides are distinctive, but they're interactive. And if you think about how the military reacts to elites, how elites react to lower classes, and how lower classes react to elites, it's never they never design their strategy and action without taking into account the perceived or expected reaction of the other sides. So in order to theorize them as distinct, you have to abstract from the dynamic dimension. And I think one of the benefits of the transition literature was to bring the dynamic distinction into the center of the analysis. So the question here is, what happens once we start thinking in strategic terms? The next point I want to make is, what is the difference between, does it really matter to think about unconsolidated authoritarian or democratic regimes or not? And I would argue there are two conditions under which that would matter. The first one is that if that is has predictive power. So if we say there is unconsolidated democracy, that in a sense allows us to predict that a breakdown of democracy becomes more likely. So the question is it true? And if it's not true, that is the other side of it. If it's not true, if we cannot make that prediction, why should we care about the unconsolidated dimension? Why should we incorporate? Why should we complicate our analysis if it doesn't have any predictive power? So that's the question here. Finally, you bring in, to justify the evolution of the Greek case, the logic of deconsolidation, which is different from consolidation or unconsolidation. So you argue that the Greek case after the crisis has become an instance of deconsolidated democracy. And here, of course, we get into the very fraught issue of the relationship between attitudes and behavior. And obviously, trying to capture attitudes as distinct from behavior is not a very easy thing. So certainly, what happened in Greece was, if you looked at public opinion surveys, what in the past used to be described as a crisis of representation. People started having lower levels of trust towards democratic institutions. But I would argue that's not limited to Greece. We have observed that trend. What is that trend then is the question. Is that a signal of deconsolidation that should make us worry that perhaps those institutions are not as strong? Or is it something that may be due to other factors and has nothing to do with how those regimes may evolve? And in fact, if we were to push the analysis on the Greek side a bit more, one could say that in spite of these public opinion trends of deconsolidation during the crisis, the big news of the Greek case was the extent to which those democratic institutions proved, in the end, extremely resilient in the face of an enormous economic shock. So, what is to give is the question. Are attitudes, as measured by public opinion surveys, really relevant or not, is my question. And that, of course, has implications for the Turkish case as well. Where are we? Are we in a situation in which a non-military regime that is moving in an authoritarian direction is consolidating? Or is it just a glitch in a process that continues to be perhaps in a circuitous way or in a more complicated way, still a process in the democratization story? So what would be the question, and how your theory help us highlight the answer to that question?
I wanted to come last because I hoped that many of the things that needed to be said would be said by the previous two, and then I could hoover up a few remaining observations. And indeed, I completely want to repeat what Stathis has just said about the merits of the book, the contribution, taking the debate forward, drawing on what has really now been quite a long evolution of theory in these matters. I liked the long-run perspectives. I liked the paired comparison, which was an appropriately chosen paired comparison. I like the use of a well-specified model to stand back from the material and give it some structure. I like the putting of the military in its broader political context rather than just treating it from the military in its own terms, which quite a lot of the earlier literature did. And I think it was also useful to have the shadow cases in Chapter 7. I should say to those who haven't read the book that what you've heard so far is very heavily based on Chapter 2, which is the theoretical core of the thesis. The rest of the book tells you a great deal, well worth knowing, a lot of it quite rich and complex historical analysis. As she said, there are 4 authoritarian regimes, 6 democracies, 10 varied kinds of coups, and 4 countries. So there's a lot of ground empirically covered. None of that it hasn't been possible to present that here so far, but a great merit of the book is in those other chapters as well. On the methodological questions, I didn't really want to go into the methodology, and Stathis has done most of what I wanted to say. I think the only one the two I'm going to pick out are, I never felt happy with consolidation as a term, and your use of it doesn't make me feel any happier. Consolidation seems to last for remarkably short periods of time in some cases. You have, even on page 146, a heading which is called A Bogus Turn Towards Democratic Consolidation. So we've got deconsolidation, we've got bogus consolidation, we've got... I think there's a lot of difficulties around that terminology, which one might want to explore a little bit more, but I won't do that. And I think the other question, like any model where you're testing historical realities by first of all drawing up a model, you have to identify some key actors or forces, and you have to simplify very much what might be motivating their behaviour. So in your case, you've got elites, masses, and military. Those are the 3 operative actors, and necessarily in the model they're assumed, it's thought to be fairly clear what they might want to do, and that they are unitary. Well, certainly the model works better if they're agents with unitary intent. Well, in fact, of course, when we look at the cases, a lot of what's going on is the shift, the divisions internally and the disagreements over what is it we're trying to do, why are we trying to do it, who do we need as partners in order to achieve the things we're going to achieve. When we're weighing up the costs of alternatives, we're weighing up not just sort of static costs, we're weighing up estimates of very uncertain dynamic processes. If I choose to go this way, how will the other side react? How solid will that alliance be? How far will we be able to overcome resistance as compared to going the other way? A lot of this, it's important to stress, is about perceptions. And there's a very, in the nature of things like coups, or struggles between authoritarian and democratic regimes, there's a lot of disagreement and a lot of uncertainty surrounding the perceptions. So to some extent, actors make their choices in a fog, and perhaps because of personal convictions, or because it's too complicated to work out what the real balance of probabilities are, but this is the traditional way that a military man would behave in such a situation. There are all kinds of things like that. Anyway, the way I would then take that forward is I would like a little bit more on specifically the military as the, more or less. Your thesis is that we should treat it as an actor. We should give it agency and not think of it as acting on behalf of some other force, and I quite agree with that. But then we need to consider a little bit, so what is it that different militaries think are there, what is it they're trying to optimize? It's not just, I'm trying to stay in power. Obviously, military prefer not to be dismantled or overthrown by popular revolution or something like that. So there are some bottom lines of that kind, but they have other objectives as well. And those objectives, among other things, include working effectively to defend the national security as they perceive it. Now, once we start bringing that in, we have to look at the choices that the military are making, not just in terms of this game, elite masses military, which is an internal political balance game, but in terms of the international situation and the international incentives and constraints that they act on. And that is not as prominent in the book and in the analysis as I would want it to be. As you probably know, international dimensions of democratization is one of my themes. And in that field, I've talked about things like the incentive structure provided by the EU, and I read the things you do say on that subject, and it's clear that one should not reach the conclusion that any of the actors behaved simply, automatically in response to external incentives. But we perhaps need to give a little bit more attention to some of the powerful military political and military incentives and constraints in operation in these various cases. I could go on at great length, but I'm going to pull out one example which is, I think, rather crucial and which isn't really in the book, and I hope that at some point you might. I know that you've written about this subject elsewhere, but it isn't in the book, which is Cyprus. So one of the things that a Greek military have to be interested in is defending the integrity of the Greek world. And that included, for many military, enosis, because the uncompleted business of bringing the island of Cyprus into Greece. One of the objectives of great importance to the Turks is the preservation of the security of the Turkish Republic after it has been broken up with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and not allowing the Greeks to get away with things that would damage that. So you have actually military establishments with diametrically opposed interests and an arena of conflict, which is Cyprus, which has to be brought into given more prominence, I would say, in analysing under what circumstances do different things happen. So why is Greece, quotes, consolidated democracy after 1974? Why is it then that the military, who'd been so powerful in Greece until 1974, aren't any longer? Well, at least a part of that had to do, surely, with the fact that a right-wing faction of the Greek military, who, by the way, were colonels. It's not an accident that it was the colonels' coup. This tells us that the military was not a united actor. They had broken with the generals, and they needed to justify their authority by achieving things through military means, and they tried to achieve the forced incorporation of Cyprus. And the result of that was that the Turks invaded Cyprus. And the result of that was that the rationale of the Greek military as the great defender of Greek national interest was comprehensively destroyed. I'm not saying that's the only explanation, but it certainly was an important element in understanding what happened in 74, I would say. And then that brings in other international elements that are in your book, but I would again sort of like more of them, which has to do with, I mentioned the European Union, but NATO. So one of the things that happens to reduce let's say in other countries, let's say in Spain and Portugal, one of the things that happens is that the military discover that they can find an important and useful role in society despite the fact they're under civilian control, because they are a well-funded, well-trained, professionally respected component of an international project, which is the NATO alliance. The whole dynamics of your story revolves around, the Cold War and NATO don't get the prominence that I guess I would have given them. I read carefully the footnote in which you explain that the Truman Declaration wasn't quite as important as we used to think it was, and I dare say you're right on that. But it still seems to me that, following the Greek story, for example, it was quite important that, on the one hand, the Greek colonels staying within NATO. NATO, remember, was a treaty agreement which said it was to defend freedom and democracy. Well, after a civil war, defeating the communists, you could understand that there would be some limits on the extent to which that democracy would be tolerated in Greece in the immediate time. But by 1967, there was a really sharp contradiction, I would say, between the NATO commitment and what the colonels were going to do, which was to go violently against it. And that put the NATO alliance into difficulties, and it has implications for explaining why the colonels' regime was so embattled, and it undermined the domestic elite support that they could have, I would say. And then they provoke really a conflict with another NATO power. They're really creating international difficulties, which precipitate probably a stronger effort on the part of particularly Brussels, but probably the US as well, than would otherwise have occurred, to change the direction of Greece so that doesn't happen again. There's more. I've picked on the Cyprus story because it does seem to me a very vivid illustration, but I think that perhaps the many fascinating cases that you tell us about could be enriched beyond your model by giving a little more attention to the international determinants or factors that shape the choices available to these two military regimes. And by the way, you can then, we can look at Egypt, and when I came to chapter 7, which I enjoyed, and when I come to now, which is the afterword, those thoughts were still in my mind.
Thank you very much, Laurence. By the way, can I just make a follow-up comment to what you said, Laurence, this last point? How important do you think is the international dimension in the imposition of a military regime? It's clearly very important in the decomposition, the breakdown. But what about, which is what Yaprak is talking about?
Well, Yaprak is the analyst on this, and I kept looking every time there was a coup. I'd think to myself, okay, so what's the timing of that coup? and how is it being received in Washington? And we could now go to the U.S. National Archives and see what, whoever it was, Nixon.
I did.
Yes,
I
okay.
did.
But, well, good. But so maybe the answer is that Yaprak didn't pay any attention because there's nothing in there to illustrate. But certainly there was a wide belief in some of those cases. The opponents of the coup believed that the military was acting with international tolerance or encouragement. I think sometimes the timing of the coup was determined by the fact that it was just an election moment when, you know, Jimmy Carter was no longer in a position to do anything about it, and before Ronald Reagan came in, for example, right? If I was trying to judge, is this the right moment to do a coup? And what kind of a thing can I do when I do a coup? The way in which the Pentagon might react is surely a factor that I would take into account.
Yes, lots and lots of comments. Thank you very much to both of you. Luckily, some of your questions I've already thought about them, and despite this possible criticism, I still decided to go ahead with what I had in mind. And then there are, of course, questions that I haven't thought about, and I might not be in a position to answer at the moment. One question. Okay, so two, let's say, regarding methodology. One was Stathis' arguments, the difference between the costs of toleration and costs of suppression, whether they are, the model itself, basically, whether they are basically the flip side of each other, and whether they are distinct but interactive, and that sort of thing. The way I used the model was actually you have seen this, like all of these factors. Okay, so basically, if you look at a book, for those of you who might in the end purchase it, I have a list of factors that explain various outcomes. So all of these factors, if I write a book taking account all of these factors, it won't be a model. It won't be parsimonious. And this is not a parsimonious model, by the way. It's not parsimonious at all. It's meso level, if you will. It's not macro, it's not micro, it's somewhere in between, which I think both of you liked. You make a choice. You either go into detail with each case, and you stress each detail as being important, and then you move into a historical analysis more than a political science analysis. Or you come up with a model that was suggested before, and then collect all of these factors into 2 dimensions, and then start discussing things, because it just provides more parsimony. I chose the latter. I believe that this model and the cost of suppression, cost of toleration makes sense because it can bring together many different factors in a relatively easy to understand framework. So this, I would say, is the usefulness of the model. And there are factors that affect both of them. I completely agree with you, but there are others that don't affect both of them. So that are distinctive. For instance, the unity of the military is something, from my perspective, is something that only influences the power of the military. And it doesn't necessarily relate to the cost of toleration, for instance. Okay, so this is why, I think the framework is useful. The second criticism, and we discussed this with Othon as well many times, several months ago, the term consolidation, whether we should keep it or not. This was a hot terminology, basically, at some point in time in the 1990s, to especially describe Southern European cases. And I'm aware of the criticisms of the terminology. Why did I decide to stick to it and not, replace it with another terminology? Because for me, consolidation captures attitudes. And yes, it is difficult to distinguish attitudes from behaviors, but it is not that difficult to distinguish attitudes from institutions. So there are institutions that can be stable, like in the Greek case, but then attitudes might change. Does the term consolidation and knowing this attitudinal dimension give us predictive power? It doesn't, actually. And I'm also aware of that. I say that explicitly, that consolidation does not mean durability, for instance. You can be unconsolidated and very durable, for instance. And yet you can be consolidated and then collapse as a regime very quickly. So it doesn't have predictive power as such, and I agree with that. But for me, attitudes matter, and I'm going to be giving a personal example, okay? For me, it matters because in Turkey, for instance, if the Turkish regime is an unconsolidated authoritarian regime, then that means there are still people, a significant minority, a significant, perhaps even majority in Turkey that still has liberal preferences. Knowing that gives me hope, okay? It's very personal, but I think it's important. Knowing that also scares me, because that means that the regime can get bloody, because, you know, if there are liberals who prefer to change the regime towards democracy again, the authoritarian regime might, you know, try to repress them, and then we might end up with a very bloody situation. So when you live in a context, it matters if your neighbors are liberal or not. If the rest of society, the majority or the minority is liberal or not. That's the authoritarian context. In a democracy, it matters if 90% of the people vote for a fascist totalitarian party. Then that scares me, because I don't want to live in a society where 10% can think about like overthrowing the democratic regime. That's scary. That means that there can be violence, and we've seen that in Greece happening. So does the term consolidation matter? For me, it matters at a very personal level, and this is why I, insisted on this term. And I do agree with you that it doesn't provide anything in terms of like predictability and, perhaps like from a political science perspective, it's not that helpful. And the alternative terminologies. Illiberal democracy. We talked about this as well in this room. It's an oxymoron. I mean, what is it? Like a democracy for us is a liberal democracy. So illiberal liberal regime. I mean, that's an oxymoronic thing. I cannot prefer that term. What then do I do? Just stick with democracy and authoritarianism? But then again, when I live through these regimes, there are differences. There's a personal experience. How do I capture that? Still, I thought like consolidation was a term that captured it. Okay. In terms of international factors, I mean, you're right. I mean, I play them down. But I play them down because of two reasons, right? One is because this is Greece and Turkey and Thailand and Egypt, and I think stressed it in the book and in the presentation as well. Without military aid from the United States, nothing would have been the same. So without the EU's influence, perhaps like signaling in domestic politics wouldn't have been the same. But since these are the four countries I'm dealing with, since this is the scope condition, I can play it down a little bit. If I had introduced the international dimension to the figure, then the figure wouldn't have existed, because it would have been such a complicated thing that it would be impossible to talk about it. Cyprus, I mean, in the case study, I talk about the importance of Cyprus, and one of the dimensions of the costs of suppression was basically like international war type situations that decrease the power of the military or increase the power of the military. And in the case studies, you have that, like for instance, megali idea being, one of the factors that increased the power of the military. It made the Greek military a significant actor because the state poured resources into the military in order to fight this external war, which then the military could use against its internal enemies. So I think the international dimension is there, but it is subsumed under the cost of toleration and cost of suppression language, which then again goes back to my answer to you. This is why I chose this dimension, because to make it appear as less contingent, and then to show that there are actually patterns to what's happening. And your point is a very interesting point, decoupling of military coups from civilian control, the undemocratic civilian control, that civilian control leading to authoritarianism. Is this the recent trend, or is this a glitch? I don't know. But is it something that I thought about? Obviously. I mean, like the Turkish case is pushes you to basically think about it. Yes, now the civilians, the government controls the military, but we don't have democracy. So I think definitely we need to do more research on this. We need to unpack this concept of civilian control, talk about different types of civilian control. Already people are doing that. There is some good scholarship looking at different models of civilian control. And I think we need to be doing more of this in the upcoming years.
Well, Yaprak, one thing is sure, you are at the center of the intellectual interest right now, because most of the countries in the world are going towards authoritarianism, so whatever you have to say, it's going to be relevant. It was great. I think that was your first book launch,
yes.
Celebration of your book. We wish you many more. Congratulations, and it gave us food for thought. Thank you very much for discussions, first-rate discussions, and thank you for coming.